In this tutorial, I'll show you how you can quickly and easily color grade your images using the color balance tool in Photoshop. Hi there, Michael Volshinovich here from Vibrant Shot. You can find me via the social media links below, and also make sure that you subscribe to this YouTube channel so you get future updates just like this one. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how to color grade your image using the color balance tool in Photoshop. Now, if you've actually seen my color grading course on Retouching Academy, I do cover the color balance tool a little bit, but I wanted to cover it in a little bit more detail, particularly for people that have seen that video. You'll kind of get a better context of where all of this fits, but I'll try and kind of keep it general for people that haven't seen that course. And the reason I really think the color balance tool is a great tool to use for color grading because it's very quick and very intuitive. So you can very quickly get from one look to a completely different look, really just using that one tool. And it's really simple to use in my mind. And generally speaking, it's become kind of the go-to tool that I have for color grading most of my images, at least, sort of laying out the foundation for my color grading. So let's go ahead and actually look at, before we start color grading some of these images, let's just look at how this tool really works in general. So if we go into here and pick color balance, we can see that color balance has a couple of different color sliders here, and we have a tone, which is really just a tonal range of shadows, midtones, and highlights. So, what are we affecting with our adjustments? Is it the highlights, is it the shadows, or is it the midtones? And midtones you'll find is kind of almost like a white balance adjustment in that it sort of affects, the entire image. So oftentimes it's a good starting point for your adjustment because that's going to make the largest and most broad sort of adjustment across your image in terms of the color changes that you make. So basically within any of these we can say, if we want more cyan, we pull it this way. If we want more green, we push the next slider this way, or if we want more magenta instead, and so on and so on. So we can make all of these changes very quickly. Now, what's important to kind of understand is what does this tonal range really do, and how does it affect your image? So for that, I've created these three gradients, which essentially go from white to black. And let's go ahead and turn on every one of these color balance adjustments. And all I've done within these, sorry about that, let's click there, is, for example, in the shadows adjustment, I've just gone into shadows and pushed blue to 100. For the midtone one, I went to midtones and I pushed, so I went like midtone and I pushed blue to 100, and then with the highlights one, I just went to highlights and pushed blue to 100. So all of them kind of do the same thing, but they're each adjusted to those three different tonal ranges. So if we turn that on one at a time, you can see the difference between the three. So this is where we pushed highlights, this is where we push midtones, and this is where we push shadows. So kind of counterintuitively, where we have shadows, you would kind of think that it's all going to be in the shadow range, but it's not really the case. It does kind of adjust everything. Like we can see blues in here. If we turn that off, you can certainly see the effect of the blue creeping into the highlight range. With midtone, you can see it's like just nice and progressive and evenly across the luminosity range, applying the blue. And then with highlights, again, you would expect to see it kind of in this area here, but in reality, it is kind of creeping into the shadows as well. So even though it says shadows and highlights, it's not necessarily just shadows and highlights. It's kind of affecting everything, but what shadows means is it's going to predominantly affect shadows. And then with highlights, it's predominantly going to affect highlights, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to creep into the other luminosity ranges. So what we can do to counter that is if you want a really targeted adjustment, we can use, for example, a blend if. Now, before we do that, just notice as well that the effect generally is very minor on the very brightest luminosities and on the very darkest luminosities. The reason for that is that, you can't really color grade white. I mean, a almost blown out highlight is going to be a blown out highlight. You can't really add yellow to white. It's still going to be kind of white, so it doesn't really affect the extremes too much. Similarly here, you don't actually change the black point too much. The black kind of just remains black, whereas something like, for example, selective color, if we go into blacks, it'll actually change the luminosity of the black in order to accommodate more blue, if we were to do that. So just be aware of that it really doesn't affect extremes. It's kind of from sort of this point to here is where we're getting on the very extreme ends, very minor changes to those. So if we want to, for example, constrain this to just shadows, what we can do is we can double click and then use the blend if. So we know that we want to get rid of it on the highlight end. And if you start to slide this, you'll see the effect here. So we've kind of cut it off at that range. Now, obviously we don't want the cutoff to be that abrupt. So for that, we can just use this slider here and just hold down the Alt or Option key when you click on this, and it will allow you to split that. And then we can kind of just feather this out a little bit to target the range that we want. Now, one thing with doing this that's important to note is that it's not 100% perfect. If you're doing this on commercial image and you want to be perfect, your better bet is maybe to use something like a luminosity mask and then clip the actual adjustment to the luminosity mask, or just mask it into the actual adjustment itself. You can look up luminosity masks. I'm not going to cover them here because it's sort of beyond the scope, but as a quick and dirty sort of way of constraining it, the blend if works just fine. And generally speaking, for a typical image, nobody will notice the difference in quality. The reason I like blend if over a luminosity mask is that it's portable, and that's kind of one thing that I really talk about in my color grading course is portability. I can take my color grade from one image, paste it in another image that is, for example, part of the same series, and immediately I will get the same color grading. Whereas if I use something like a mask, the mask won't translate because the image is different. So sort of the benefit of the color balance is you get portability, but you lose a little bit in color, or sorry, not in color, in quality. So just be aware of that. I mean, generally speaking, in most cases, the difference in quality, most people won't ever notice. So jumping out of this, now that we kind of have an idea of what we're targeting, let's go to our first image here. And what my goal is essentially to take this image from this sort of very warm, sunset looking kind of image to just something that's a little bit more neutral and almost cool. So to do that, we're going to obviously grab our color balance adjustment. And in this case, this image here, I'm going to start with the midtones tonal range. And the reason for that is that this image is kind of neither high key nor low key. It's kind of in the middle. So that's why I'm going to use midtones. Now on this image here, we can see that it's definitely more towards the high key end of things. And so when we start our adjustments there, we're going to start on the highlight end because it really just kind of feels brighter overall. So the biggest, sort of effect, the biggest bang for our buck is going to be found in the highlights end of things. So back to this one, we're going to start with midtones. And again, I want to just kind of cool it down and make it look a little bit more neutral, just kind of wipe out that whole sunset look from it. Obviously, we can do some of this using the white balance adjustment on our raw file, but I'm just giving this as an example. If this was a sort of a neutral base image where it wasn't so warm, we can really take it to the extreme and make it look very cool. So you can kind of do that on your own image as well. But in this case, I'm going from one extreme, which is very warm, to another extreme, which is fairly cool. So obviously to cool it down, we need to add a lot of blue because we have a lot of yellow in this image. So let's go ahead and kind of push our blue to kind of a point where we think it looks reasonable. I mean, I think, kind of going to here is a little too much. That's really getting too blue for me. Back here, maybe not quite enough. So somewhere in here is maybe where I want to start. Generally what I find is if I'm cooling it down, I want to go a little too far because then we're going to offset it by applying other colors above here. So by pushing it to around the 40 range, we can see that we've started to introduce a lot of magenta into things. And I don't really want that. And that just kind of happens because naturally if I'm pushing in one color, other colors start to pop out. So the magenta is really a little too much for me, and we can very quickly get rid of that just using the magenta green slider. By adding more green, I'm going to get rid of the magenta. So if we start pushing this, we can see that this is probably too much. So let's just start sliding back until we get to a point that looks pretty good. And I think around plus 11 is probably pretty good. Now, one thing that I found now is that we're left with a lot of cyans in the image, particularly kind of in, these shadow areas. They look a little bit cyanish, and the skin tone is starting to get a little washed out. So let's add back a little bit of red, and we can just do that by pushing this to, let's say, +4. And that's, I think, a good starting point. You can see just, using those 3 sliders, we've gone from very warm to something that is a lot more neutral and a lot more cool. And now what I'm going to do is at this stage, I generally will refine it a little bit by going into highlights and shadows. So for highlights, we're going to kind of try and, we're going to affect these middle areas of the face here where we have a little bit of highlight and obviously within the background here. So Let's go ahead and start with our yellow slider, and let's just kind of see where we want to go with this. So maybe we want to just warm the highlights up a tiny bit, because we know that our shadows have a fair bit of blue to them. So what I tend to want to do is, if I add a lot of blue to the shadows, I want to add a little bit of yellow, which is kind of the opposite color, to the highlights, so that it kind of creates that complementary color kind of look. So let's go ahead and slide this down just a little bit here, maybe something like that. And then again, we have a fair bit of magenta in our shadows, so I'm going to once again add the opposite, which is going to be a little bit of green. So maybe something in and around there. And then lastly, I tend not to ever add any red into highlights, because as you can see, it doesn't really look great. I mean, unless there's, a ton of cyan already in your highlights and you want to offset that, generally I don't really add a lot of red. So let's go ahead and go in the other direction here and just maybe add a tiny bit more cyan into the highlights. And then we'll jump into our shadows and kind of finish things off here. So I want to maybe add just a little bit more blue into the shadows, so something like that, just to kind of, again, contrast with the warm skin tone, a little bit of the yellow in the skin tone. Maybe a little bit more, get a little bit more green, just to get rid of some of that magenta tone. I don't particularly like the magenta tone that's in here, so let's just go ahead and get rid of that. And lastly, let's go ahead and add just a little bit more red into our shadows. Some of these areas here, the shadow areas of the face, are looking a little bit kind of dirty, so let's just go ahead and add a little bit of red just to make the skin tone a little bit more lively. So there we go. Something like that I think is pretty good. All right, so with just a couple of adjustments, we've really taken the image from this very warm feeling image to something that is a little bit more neutral, and even more so on the cool side. Now, after you make these adjustments, first of all, when you go in here, don't ever kind of uncheck preserve luminosity, because otherwise it's just kind of a mess. It really screws up the actual luminosity values of your image. So leave that checked on. And one thing you may want to do too is when you're done with sort of more drastic color balance adjustments, maybe go into something like curves. I find that we maybe lost a little bit of contrast here. So let's go ahead and go into linear contrast. We'll just add a bit of contrast and then just kind of scale this back in terms of opacity, just so that we get a little pop of contrast in there. So let's pull it back even more. Yeah, maybe something like that. So let's just kind of group this together. And then, before and after, as you can see, really quick, really easy, and has a dramatic impact on the overall look of your image. Now, one thing I'm also going to mention with color balance, when you're making these dramatic changes, is very important where you position other adjustments within your color grading. So, oftentimes color grading, as I show my color grading course, has kind of several steps to it. So in this case, I may want to refine things using something like selective color, or perhaps hue saturation. So for example, if I have hue saturation, let's say I want to work on blues with hue saturation, maybe I find that they're still a little too blue. We can go into, for example, blues here. We can target blue, and we can crank down the saturation, and you see immediately what effect that has on the blues. Now, if we pull it down and we pull it below our color balance, you'll see that the effect is almost non-existent. If we kind of jump back and forth, you can really see it here. You can't see it too much down here. It's still very blue. And the reason for that is that the blues that are here were kind of injected through the color balance tool. Like everything here, there's really no blues in it. Everything is very warm. So, if I wanted to target yellows, I may want to do it below my color balance, because it's going to target a broader range of yellows. If I move this above, then it will affect whatever color changes have been made by the color balance tool. So just kind of be aware of that if you want to make color targeted adjustments beyond color balance using either hue sat or selective color. Just be aware of where you position them in your layer stack, whether it's above or below. So let's go ahead and take a look at our second image now, where we're going to give a little bit more of a retro feel to this image as a whole. Now I also want to show you this action that I've created for you. So it's called the VS Color Balance Stack, and essentially that will, if we click on it, give us a stack of color balance adjustments that are targeted a little bit more carefully to a particular luminosity range. So kind of going back to what we showed in this gradient example, where we used blend if. We've done that here as well. So for example, the shadow has been constrained to just the shadow range, and then we've sort of clipped off the highlights so they don't get affected. So to use that, if we wanted to target shadows, we would click here, make sure you go into the shadow tonal range. Midtones is always the default. There's no way to set that using an action, so you'll just have to remember that if you're going into shadows, select shadow tonal range. And if we make an adjustment here, you can see that we're not really affecting the highlights in any way. We're just affecting the shadow values. So that's just something that you can use if you want to be very targeted with your color balance adjustments. Now in this case, we're going to just use this mid-tone one that's going to affect everything because it'll work just fine for us in this particular image. So to give it more of a retro feel, and because we know this is more of a high key image, I'm going to use the highlights tonal range because I think that's going to kind of work a little bit better in this particular case. And I'll sort of show you the difference between using midtones and highlights for this. So let's go into highlights for starters. And to give kind of a more retro feel, we know that we're going to be sort of using greens and cyans, and then maybe in the shadows we're going to try and oppose some of those colors. So I'm not going to start with a blue, unlike in the previous image where I knew I wanted to get rid of yellows, so I need to add blue. Here I know that I'm going to play with cyans and greens, so let's start with cyans and greens. And so if we start to kind of nudge this up, immediately we can see that we're getting to more of this sort of retro-ish feel. Like right away it looks completely different. And so maybe cyans, again, I want to kind of play with it. Now again, don't pull your values down too much. You can kind of see what it's doing to the highlights here. It's really starting to blow them out. So be careful not to push your values too far. A little bit of kind of blowing out of the highlights or blackening of the shadows is okay if it works for that particular look, but obviously you don't want to really screw up the luminosity ranges within your image. So make sure that you exercise a little bit of restraint there. So something like this is starting to look pretty good, I think. Maybe a little bit of blue in our highlights I think will look better. So let's just go ahead and do something like that. So I think that's a good starting point, and we can see that immediately just with those sliders we have achieved something that looks fairly retro. So what I'm going to do now is affect the shadows. I'm not going to even touch the midtones in this particular image because midtones will affect the whole of the image, and really I just want to affect some of these shadows now. Now that we've sort of graded the overall image, we want to refine things a little bit with just shadows. So for shadows, again, to kind of further play up some of that retro feel, we know that we can maybe add a little bit of blue into the shadows. So if we kind of play around with this and go with something like +5, and then again playing up with magenta, now that we've added a lot of cyan into the highlights, again doing that sort of opposing principle here with complementary colors, we can add a little bit of magenta. So maybe something like that. And furthermore, because we added a little bit of cyan, let's maybe add a little bit of red as well to our shadows. So something like that, and gives us this very kind of punchy retro look to it. And so toggling that on and off, we can see very quickly we achieve that look using just a couple of sliders. Now I'll show you the difference if we tried to actually use midtones instead. So let's go ahead and select color balance. Going into midtones, now let's try and make the same adjustment we did. So we went +11 on our greens, -2, and +2, I think, something like that. So you can really see the difference in midtone made. Midtone, it didn't give us that look at all. It kind of just washed out the whole image. All of our shadow areas now look very washed out. I mean, we can try and attempt to recreate that, but you can see that, the green is really, it's not giving us the look that we want. It's just giving us this very kind of low-key, lo-fi kind of look, which I didn't want. I wanted to keep it nice and vibrant and punchy. And so that's where that difference comes in. And you really have to sort of experiment and know, which one you should be working with in order to achieve the look that you want. The big difference between this and this here. So in the case of a high key image, generally start with the highlights. In the case of a low key image, generally start with the shadow slider. And in the case of a neutral one like we had here, start with midtones and kind of go from there. But it also kind of depends on what it is that you're really working on changing. In this image, I knew that it was sort of as a whole, I wanted to change the image. Here, I really knew that it was the highlights that were going to give me the look I want, because everything here is really sort of a highlight. The highlights within the skin, the background, everything is very bright and airy. So that's why I started with the highlight slider. So that's kind of a quick demonstration of how color balance works. Again, all of this has to be coupled with sort of your eye and your vision for the image. And just a lot of experimentation. But, general principles, just key things to keep in mind. Think about whether you're starting with a high key, neutral, kind of, middle of the range image, or a very low key image, and that will affect sort of your starting point. Think about what direction you want to take your image in. Is there a particular color you want to inject? Do you want to cool it down? Do you want to warm it up? And also think about, kind of opposing values. So if we add a lot of blue like we did in this one, it brought out a lot of magenta. So then let's scale back magenta. So it's kind of this very fluid process where you add one color and you have to take away another color until you get to this point that looks good to you. And then lastly, make sure you kind of think about where the color balance fits in within your layer stack, whether it is, sort of below or above certain sets of adjustments, because that will affect how those other adjustments work. So I hope you found that useful. Again, it's really just a matter of experimenting a lot. For more information on different kinds of color adjustments that you can make and sort of, color grading as a whole, be sure to check out my color grading course that you can find in the link below. And of course, make sure that you subscribe to this channel so that you get future updates just like this video here. So thanks again for watching, and we will see you next time. Take care.